On the other hand, if you take a boat from the coast of Aberdeen, Scotland, and head straight out east into the icy seas of the North Sea, you will arrive at your destination after a considerable period of time has passed. There is a possibility that you will not see anything at all for a length of time that might range anywhere from 7 to 8 hours, depending on the conditions of the weather and the speed of your boat. This is something that you should be prepared for. After then, the waves will start to move in the direction of the horizon, and as they do so, a structure will start to emerge from the water surrounding them. The initial examination reveals that it appears to be a one-of-a-kind structure that is made up of bones that are rigid. On the other side, as you draw closer, you discover that it is a large island that was made by people out of steel. It appeared as though a skyscraper and a construction site had been combined into a single structure, and then that structure was erected on top of enormous metal stilts that plunged 100 feet into the black water below. Overall, the site was quite impressive. It was in the year 2000 that this particular oil rig, which is located offshore, was given the name Magellan. The year 2000 was also the year that it was given that name. The Magellan was essentially a city because of its location in the midst of the ocean, which made it a very strategic location. In addition to its principal aim, which was to extract crude oil from deep beneath the seabed, it was always buzzing and humming with activity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This was the case during the whole operation. The people that operate on these rigs are a completely different breed from anything else in the world. The individuals who fall within this category are both male and female. Roughnecks are individuals who live and work on these isolated platforms. They commonly spend weeks and sometimes even months at a time during their life. Roughnecks are referred to as living and working on these isolated platforms. Roughnecks are seen rather frequently in the United States of America. When compared to the various vocations that are available in the world, this particular one is among the most hazardous ones. The act of walking across a deck is considered to be a calculated risk, because every outdoor surface is always slippery and covered in a layer of oil or salty spray. This is the case even for something as simple as strolling across a deck. This is because every surface is an external surface. This is the reason why this is the case. In the aftermath of a fall, there is a chance that the injury will be devastating. It is possible to lose your balance and fall from a higher platform into a lower one, which could potentially result in your death. These two scenarios are both feasible. There is a chance that this will occur. Additionally, there is the risk that you could completely fall off the rig, which would result in a fall of 100 feet into the churning and cold water below. This would be a very dangerous situation. When the notoriously terrible weather of the North Sea, which is characterized by gale force gusts and heavy showers, is taken into consideration, the likelihood of falling is significantly enhanced during the course of the day. With that being said, this is not the only risk that is pertinent to this situation. It is something that is extremely flammable, and that is crude oil, which is the same thing that they are there to obtain. They are present in order to achieve this goal. In the event that even a single spark were to be positioned in the wrong location, it has the potential to result in a catastrophic inferno that would present no escape route from the predicament. In addition, there is a phenomenon that is referred to as a blowout, which occurs when the high-pressure well that they are drilling into abruptly and violently explodes without any prior warning. The occurrence of this is something that is a possibility. Even though there are safety protocols that have been installed on rigs in an effort to prevent this from happening, it is likely that those systems will not be enough if you are in close proximity to the drill when it occurs. This is because the presence of the drill might potentially cause you to be injured. Being a roughneck is related with a number of risks that are severe and persistent at all times, regardless of the circumstances. On a consistent basis, on the other hand, the benefits are substantially more significant, and for the vast majority of people, it comes down to a single aspect, which is the most important. Quite surprisingly, the recompense is made available. In the year 2000, Gordon Moffat, a man who was 41 years old at the time, was regarded as one of these roughnecks. He was thought to be a roughneck. On the Magellan crew, he was a player. he was a member of the crew. In addition to being a husband and a father to 2 children, he was also a father to 2 children. Gordon was also a father to 2 children. Certainly, he was not the type of person who sought thrills in any way. The majority of the men who worked on the rig did so for the same reason, which was to improve their own living conditions. This was done so that they could provide a good life for their families who lived on land. This dangerous job was something that he did for the same reason that he worked in others. The thought of his wife and children, as well as the future he was constructing for them, made the hardship of his absence worthwhile. He was building in the future for them. Over the course of a considerable amount of time, he was absent. Nonetheless, the mere concept of them made the absence worthwhile. To provide a more precise explanation, he was employed for the role of a maintenance specialist for the drill mechanism itself. The fact that these enormous and intricate pieces of machinery represent the basis of the business does not change the fact that they are prone to encountering problems on a fairly consistent basis. Additionally, the drilling company is suffering financial losses for each and every minute that the drill is not spinning in order to produce the results that are necessary. This is because the drill is not spinning. A chunk of money like that is not insignificant at all. The rig had a rule that was not written down but was recognized by everyone. If the drill stopped, it was your obligation to fix it. This rule was not written down. A written record of this rule did not exist. All of that happens instantly. No matter what time of day it was, whether it was 3 in the morning or the middle of the following day, the circumstance did not change in any way. The outcome was the same, regardless of whether the weather was calm or a storm was raging. There was no difference in terms of the outcome. It was essential to take immediate action in order to discover a solution to the problem that had been presented. On the evening of October 9th of that year, Gordon had just concluded a long shift that had been quite stressful. He had just finished his shift. Just a moment ago, he had been relieved of the duties associated with his shift. The statement that he was worn out was accurate. Within the limits of this floating steel island, he had made his way back to his modest chambers, which were the only personal space he had accessible to him. He had been there for quite some time. It was difficult to move around in his accommodations, and there was a notable lack of furniture. It was highly probable that the only thing he was looking forward to was a piping hot meal and probably a brief phone call to his family before retiring for a few hours throughout the night. He had just finished taking off his heavy work boots, and he was now looking forward to getting some rest and relaxation. Despite this, the relatively tranquil atmosphere of his chamber was disrupted by the crackling sound of his radio, which occurred just as he was beginning to rest. This was a significant event. Instantaneously, he became conscious of a voice that was speaking to him and pleading with him to listen. On the contrary, the circumstances were not at all favorable. At that time, the fitness routine came to a complete end. In order to fulfill the criteria, he had to return to the deck. Gordon was a seasoned roughneck, so he was accustomed with this circumstance and did not find it strange. This was because he had been in this situation before. In spite of the fact that it was a source of annoyance, it was a vital component of the task that needed to be completed. His life had been filled with a significant number of late-night phone calls, and he had received a significant number of these calls during the course of his life. The protesting that was done in response to the circumstance was nothing more than a waste of time. In light of this, he stood up, put on his work clothes, and made his way out the door, returning to the chaos and the chilly, windy night that they had been enjoying. He did this with a deep sigh. Following that, he went back inside. In the process of arriving at the main deck, which was the focal point of the rig's major operations, Gordon came across a scene that was both disorganized and well-organized, and it had a purpose. The main deck is a massive open metal platform, and right in the midst of it is where the big drill assembly goes through the floor on its journey to the ocean, which is placed an incredible distance below. The ocean is located at a staggering distance below. The area beneath the platform is where the ocean can be found. Many of his coworkers, including a few of them, were waiting for him to arrive. The bulk of them were waiting for him. They expeditiously communicated to him the most recent information that was available concerning the matter, Specifically, the problem was with some cabling that was situated just beneath the main deck. This is some further information. The fact that these wires on the main deck itself were not accessible was the root cause of the problem. This was due to the fact that it was unable to access them. On the level that was directly below the one that was being accessed, there was a point of access that was located. They had done this process a large number of times in the past, despite the fact that it was quite tough to carry out. This was something that they had done a great deal of times in the past. When it came to maintenance, it was a straightforward task. In accordance with the plan, Gordon was intended to take an elevator down one level in order to arrive at the platform that was located directly below the main deck. To begin, the crew on the main deck would first take a safety harness that was attached to a long, durable cable. After that, they would feed the harness down to him through a small access hole that was situated in the floor of the main deck. The upper deck would be the location where this would take place. These little service ports on rigs are referred to as mouse holes, which is the phrase that is used to describe this particular hole. Additionally, this particular hole is referred to as a mouse hole by its name. It was estimated that the diameter of the thing that was being discussed was approximately 10 inches. In the case that Gordon found himself on the lower deck, he would look up, see the harness coming down through the mouse hole, and then he would grab it and put it on instead of the mouse. That would be his plan. In order to guarantee that it was tightly attached, he would wrap it around his waist for that purpose. Next, he would give the crew on the main deck a signal, a thumbs up, so that they could see him plainly through the gap. This would allow them to see him more clearly. Each and every one of them had a clear view of him. Once they had finished their turnaround, they would send a signal to the hoist operator, who was also a member of the crew. This would indicate that they were ready to continue. The individual who was in charge of operating the hoist was situated in a small control cab that was situated slightly above and behind the team that was working on the main deck. When the hoist operator was standing, he was unable to view Gordon or the mouse hole because of the nature of his position. This was the case because of the nature of his position. He had no idea what he was doing and relied solely on the messages that were being communicated by the crew that was aboard the main deck. He was utterly uninformed about what he was doing. Additionally, it was his responsibility to operate the winch, which was a robust motorized drum. He was the one who was accountable for making use of it. During the time that it was being utilized, the wire that was attached to Gordon's harness was supposed to be coiled up over itself. Gordon would be elevated off the lower platform in a gentle and secure manner while simultaneously dangling in the air before the hoist operator would start the winch as soon as he received the signal. This would take place while Gordon was suspended in the air. In order for him to be able to access the cables that were malfunctioning, it would be necessary to hoist him to a height of approximately 10 feet high. When he had finished making the necessary repairs, he would be brought back down to earth and then lowered back down again. In no way is it challenging. This thing happens rather frequently. Without risk, provided that all individuals fulfilled their tasks in a manner that was deemed acceptable. Due to the fact that this was the case, Gordon made his way from the main deck to the small industrial elevator, where he proceeded to descend one level. He walked out of the building after exiting the elevator on the bottom platform and leaving the building. At this particular location, the darkness was more pervasive, and the wind that blasted through the steel skeleton of the rig was more forceful than it had been previously. It wasn't until he looked up that he realized that the faces of his coworkers were looking down at him through the mouse hole that was 10 inches in diameter. He was surprised to see them. A moment had passed before the harness was dangling down through the opening, and it was gently swinging in the breeze. This occurred as soon as the moment had passed. There was not the slightest bit of a departure from the initial concept. Gordon caught it in his grasp and took it with him. As soon as he had finished putting on the leg straps, he brought the harness all the way up to his ankles and then fastened it round his waist to ensure that it was adequately protected. He gave it a couple of forceful pulls with the purpose of ensuring that it was tight and snug. He thought this would be the best way to accomplish this. In spite of the fact that he was a professional, he never made any kind of compromises with regard to the safety of the situation. After reaching a position where he was content, He looked up at the crew and offered a clear indication of satisfaction by giving a thumbs up. He was satisfied with the team's performance. On his own, he was prepared. It was possible for the crewmen who were stationed on the main deck to pick up his signal. One of them turned around and used a hand signal that was very clear and that they had all prepared in order to successfully communicate with the individual who was operating the hoist. He became aware of the signal while he was sitting in his cab, which is when the hoist operator was able to see it. A thumbs up was his response, and he proceeded to turn on the winch after hearing it. A faint hum could be heard as the winch started to turn, and the wire started to reel in as it was being drawn in that direction. The occurrence of both of these events took place concurrently. While Gordon was standing on the platform, he felt his feet progressively lift off of the steel grating that was supported by it. This occurred while he was standing on the base of the platform. The harness and the wire were providing him with complete support for his weight at the time that he was hung in the air. As he continued to climb slowly over the course of a number of moments, the lower deck began to decrease in size underneath him. Eventually, he reached a height of approximately 10 feet. Which was perfectly level with the collection of wires that he wanted to replace. He eventually reached his goal. He was currently situated on the main deck, which was not too far below the crew. It was not too far below them. By looking through the hole in the mouse, he was able to gain a view of them that was unobstructed. It was through the use of a wave that he conveyed to them that he was going into position before they could move into position. He declared loudly, "I'm good," in spite of the wind that was blowing. "I'm fine." The crew communicated the message to the hoist operator, and the hoist operator immediately stopped the winch after getting the message. "I'm fine." The wind was softly moving Gordon from side to side as he moved through the air at this very time. Gordon was suspended in the air at this very moment. He started the delicate work on the cables after removing his tools from the belt he was carrying and commencing to work on them. Additionally, he began working on the cables. He was the one who initiated the work in the first place. While he was working, he had to brace himself against the machinery in order to maintain his equilibrium. This was necessary in order for him to continue working. Throughout the entire ordeal, his crew was maintaining a watchful eye from above, which meant that they were ready to provide assistance in the event that it was required. He was able to perform the repair on his own after a few minutes had elapsed, with no assistance from anybody else. The cables were in no manner in danger of being damaged in any way. It has been determined that the work has been successfully completed. After putting his tools away, he looked up through the mouse hole once more and then signaled to the team something else. He also placed his tools away within the mouse hole. Subsequently, he stowed his tools safely behind him. At long last, he had succeeded in reaching his conclusion. That he was getting ready to be dropped back down to the ground was obvious to anyone who looked at him. For the first time, the crew was made aware of its existence while they were on the main deck. In order to bring the winch down to its lower position, they delivered the hand signal that had been decided upon to the hoist operator once the turn had been completed. When the operator became aware of their presence, he gave a brief nod and then swiftly grabbed for the controls in order to restart the winch. He did this as soon as he realized that they were there. Furthermore, this is the time at which the ordinary everyday procedure began to go horribly and catastrophically wrong. This is the point at which the tragedy occurred. The individual who was operating the hoist made a mistake that was one that was rather simple to identify. It is possible for anyone to make a mistake, but it is a mistake that, given the circumstances that are present in this particular setting, would have ramifications that would be lethal. It was only the switch on the right that he failed to activate, and it was the only one as well. It would be a switch that would allow the winch motor to turn in the opposite way from the direction in which it is turning, which is the current direction. It was not the winch's intention to spool the line out and gently lower Gordon back to the platform. Rather, it started to loop the wire in, which resulted in Gordon being pulled higher. At that same instant, he started working the winch for the first time. The winch moved in a manner that was slower and more sluggish than usual. On the other hand, it was not consistent with the idea that he had been propelled in a vertical trajectory. A pull that was gradual, persistent, and unyielding was applied to the group. This pull kept the group from moving forward. On the other hand, the issue was something that was readily apparent to everyone, with the exception of the one person who was in a position to put an end to it. When Gordon was in this circumstance, he had the sensation that he was rising rather than plummeting through the air. He was experiencing a severe shaking in his chest. He cried out loud, "Whoa, stop, stop!" The crew on the main deck also noticed it and exclaimed, "Wrong way!" Gordon was seen climbing toward the steel floor rather than descending, which was what they had believed he would do. They expected him to fall. At first, they were overcome with a feeling of bewilderment, and then, after that, they experienced a surge of panic. At the very moment that they came across the individual who was operating the hoist, they immediately began shouting and thrashing their arms in a wild manner. "Stop! Stop the winch! Reverse it!" Nevertheless, the commotion that was generated by the rig was so loud that it entirely overwhelmed their objections. This was the case. A lot of sounds can be heard, such as the deafening clatter of metal against metal, the shriek of the wind, and the boom of the generators. These are just some of the sounds that can be heard. It was surrounded by sound, as if it were a wall of sound waves. It was made even more difficult by the fact that the hoist operator had temporarily turned away from them after beginning the winch operation. This made the situation even more difficult. That made the position a great deal more challenging. This, from his point of view, marked the conclusion of a line of work that was considered to be exceedingly mundane. He could have been doing nothing more than stretching his back, making a note in a logbook, or taking a quick check at a gauge. All of these possibilities are possible. During the same period of time, each of these occurrences happened simultaneously. At no point in time did he direct his attention particularly toward the workers. He was completely oblivious to the idea that the imminent catastrophe was only a few yards away, despite the fact that it was coming closer. Due to the fact that the volume of the disturbance was so much higher than his hearing, he was unable to hear their frantic cries. As a consequence of this, the winch maintained its hard and unrelenting rotation in this manner. To be more specific, it seemed as though Gordon was being drawn closer and closer to the underside of the main deck, and more specifically, in the direction of that microscopic mouse hole that measured 10 inches in diameter. A feeling of anxiety began to creep into my body. It was something that Gordon was fully aware of, and he was conscious of the fact that he was unable to free himself from the harness on his own. However, it is not the case at all while it is suspended in the air. The only thing that could save him would be if the operator was able to stop the machine, which would be the only outcome that would be possible. At this very time, he was not only becoming irritated, but he was also becoming terrified of what was going to take place. During this time, he was screeching, a sound that was both frantic and primitive, like the sound of a man who is aware that his fate is drawing near, but is unable to stop it from happening. He was shouting. At the same time, the crew that was working on the main deck was experiencing a full-blown panic attack. This was happening simultaneously. Even though they were yelling at the top of their lungs and throwing their arms around like crazy people, nothing was working to get their point across. They were unable to get their point across. One of the crew members came to the idea that they needed to take a different strategy after they realized that their yells and signals were not effective. This discovery led to the realization that they needed to adopt a different approach. In order to attract the attention of the operator, he was going to have to devise a new plan with which to approach the situation. Instantaneously, he moved away from the group that was gathered around the mouse hole and began running across the deck in the direction of a nearby emergency telephone. He immediately removed himself from the gathering. The station that was in charge of operating the hoist made use of this telephone as a direct line of communication with the station. In an instant, the phone that was in the operator's cab started to ring, and he swiftly lifted the receiver from the cradle that it was lying on. He then proceeded to answer the call. When the hoist operator got back into the cab, he continued to be unaware of the situation that was taking place. He was taken aback by the abrupt and constant ringing of the phone, which caught him off guard and caused him to be taken aback. As soon as he had picked it up and placed it to his ear, he was immediately overwhelmed with frantic and frightened cries, all of which were directed toward him in an attempt to prevent the winch from being forced on him. As if a flood of uncertainty crashed over him totally, he was completely astonished. He quickly turned his head around, peered in the direction of the controls for the winch, and then slammed his hand down on the large red button that was designated for emergency stops. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. This action was carried out without him giving it even a second's consideration. It was the winch motor, which had been generating a groaning sound, that brought about the quick and abrupt halt that was brought about. At that point, however, it was already too late. Before Gordon arrived at the underside of the deck, his crewmate was frantically trying to get to the phone. Gordon had arrived just a few moments earlier. Just a few moments ago, Gordon had arrived at the location. While he was being pulled against the cold, hard steel, he twisted his body in an attempt to position himself in a vertical position. He made this effort while he was being pulled against the steel. During the time that he was contemplating it, he was thinking about the chance that he might be able to fit his upper body through the hole that was 10 inches in diameter. In spite of the fact that he was well aware that it would be incredibly painful and that it would result in bones breaking, he was willing to put his life in jeopardy for it. The amount of damage that they cause would be reduced as a result. It was not able to execute this task due to the design of the safety harness, which prevented it from being accomplished. Due to the fact that the primary straps were wrapped around his waist, he was able to maintain his seated position for the entirety of the operation. To obtain the desired outcome of straightening up into a vertical line, it was not possible to reach the desired result. Horizontal was one of the few positions that he was able to keep up for an extended period of time. He was aware of what was about to take place at the time that was about to occur, despite the fact that he was pressed up against the steel and looked up at the small circle of darkness that was above him. In a desperate attempt to ensure his own existence, he extended out his arms and legs and forced them on the underside of the deck. This was his last-ditch effort. It was a conscious effort on his part to physically fight the pull of the winch in order to achieve his goal of pulling himself away from the pit. The results of his efforts, on the other hand, were not successful. However, he was going up against a machine that possessed a power that was significantly higher than his own. He was going up against it. It was impossible for him to take any kind of action in light of this situation. Despite the fact that the winch continued to revolve, this fact remained. For the first time, his pelvis was inserted into the hole, which measured 10 inches in diameter. This was the first part of his body to be implanted. This particular part of his body was the first one to be removed from his body. The tremendous amount of pressure that was being applied to his body caused it to start disintegrating, which was a direct consequence of the situation. It was impossible to comprehend the level of anguish that he was experiencing as he let out a scream. Gordon had already left the building by the time the hoist operator finally clicked the button that indicates the stop of the hoist. However, by that time, the hoist had already stopped. There was only a small section of his torso that had been able to pass through the opening. This was the only part of his body that had been preserved. An investigation was initiated in the wake of the tragic event in order to look into the problems that were associated with the circumstance. The investigation led to the discovery that the company that Gordon owned had been flagrantly irresponsible with regard to a variety of fundamental safety procedures. This was uncovered as a result of the investigation. Unfortunately, it was found out that the hoist operator had not been given adequate training on the particular winch mechanism that he was using. This was a very unfortunate discovery. The fact that the operator and the person who was wearing the harness did not have a direct line of sight with one another constitutes a blatant violation of the statutory safeguarding procedures that are in place. The individual was dressed in the harness that they were wearing. Through the course of the investigation, it was discovered that the communication system, which relied on hand signals in an environment that was both noisy and chaotic, was significantly deficient. This was discovered during the course of the investigation. To add insult to injury, there ought to have been a specialized signaler whose sole responsibility was to communicate with the hoist operator. This constitutes the bare minimum that ought to have been present. In addition, there is the potential that the two audio lines need to have been physically connected to one another. There was no room for even a single obvious fault that could have been produced by humans because the entire system was devoid of redundancy. This meant that there was no room for any errors to occur. After it was determined that Gordon's company was to fault for these failings, they were issued a punishment of £60,000 as a consequence of this decision. Over the course of the period in which Gordon's family was in a state of grief, they were also presented with an amount of money that was kept secret. However, there is no amount of money that could bring back a husband and a father, a man who went to work one night to perform a normal job and never returned home, all because of a switch that was forgotten. Because of this, there is no amount of money that could bring back this man. The occurrence of this incident was brought about by a switch that was never called to mind. When it comes to oil rigs, which are among the most hazardous places of employment in the entire world, there is no such thing as a normal work schedule. The risks associated with these jobs are extremely high. The tragic truth of this circumstance was brought to our attention by the fact that he had passed away. To begin, I would like to convey my appreciation for your presence in this room today. If you watched the program that was broadcast today, I would be grateful if you could share your thoughts with me in the comments section. Thank you in advance for your involvement. It is also important to keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime available for you to view all at once right now. Within a single sitting, you are able to watch all of these episodes, at least till the next time we get together. How are things going? On the afternoon of October 11th, 2016, a middle-aged man named Carlos Herrera Sr. entered the visitation area of a prison in Venezuela. The room itself sort of looked like a high school cafeteria with tables and chairs everywhere for the inmates and their visitors to sit down and have their meetings. And right in front of one was one table where there was this bedraggled-looking prisoner who Carlos was there to meet. As Carlos got closer to this guy, he could see he really looked terrible, the inmate. I mean, his cheekbones were sticking out. He was sort of emaciated. He was bloodied and bruised. He had bandages on his arm. And also, as Carlos moved towards this guy, he could clearly see all the guards that lined the walls and the exits of this visitation area sort of squirm with discomfort, as this meeting is about to take place. And Carlos had a good idea why these guards might be anxious. And that is because, over the past month, this prison had been on lockdown because a gang inside the prison had risen up and overpowered the guards and completely taken over for this entire month. And just to be clear, during this month, people died as a result of this takeover. This was a horrible month for this prison. And it was only over the past couple of days that the guards were finally able to take back control. Carlos knew all this not only because this riot was all over the news while it was going on, but also because his own son, Juan Herrera Jr., was serving time in this prison for robbery. He had been for the past year. However, Carlos was not coming to visit his son right now. Instead, he was coming to visit a different prisoner because during this riot, Juan Jr. had just disappeared. And Carlos, when he had found out about that, had called prison officials, other people, politicians, you name it, to try to figure out where his son went. But nobody seemed to know. And so finally, he had found this one prisoner, the guy he was meeting today, this beaten-down-looking guy, who had agreed to come forward and tell Carlos what he knew about what happened to Juan Jr. And so Carlos sat down at this table with this prisoner. And after the two of them introduced themselves, very quickly, Carlos said, "Please, tell me what happened to my son. Where is he?" But this prisoner he was talking to did not immediately get into sort of a clear story about Juan Jr. This guy began talking about a totally separate prisoner, a man named Doran Hell Vargas. Vargas was notorious across Venezuela for a series of brutal murders he committed that ultimately put him in this prison. And during this recent riot at this prison, it was Vargas and his gang that rose up and took over. Vargas was in charge, effectively, of the entire riot. And so even though he was terrorizing people and brutalizing people and was very much responsible for the deaths of multiple inmates, he also, at the same time, did have to make sure that the people he was illegally in charge of had enough food, they had enough supplies, and they had the basic things they needed to survive. And so Carlos is listening to this man sort of lay this out about Vargas and sort of how he was in control during this riot. And Carlos was just confused. He did not understand why the man was explaining the minor details of what Vargas was doing during the riot when his own son was missing. Carlos looked at the man and said, "I just do not get it. Why are you explaining all of this to me? What does this have to do with my son?" The prisoner pointed to the bandage on his arm and pointed at all of his injuries. He told Carlos that if anybody got in the way of Vargas, they were beaten to within an inch of their lives, and some were killed. Carlos asked if that was what happened to his son, if he had been beaten by Vargas. But at that point, the prisoner just shook his head and said no. He looked down, unable to make eye contact, and said, "What happened to your son was much worse." The prisoner explained that during the riot, Juan Jr. was tapped by Vargas to help with something. Everyone had to do what Vargas asked, otherwise they would be beaten or killed. Ultimately, Juan Jr. agreed to help Vargas distribute food to the inmates. Because of the riot, the prison had been locked down, food supplies were restricted, and inmates were beginning to starve. Juan Jr. was told he needed to help provide food to these inmates. He agreed to do it, at which point he was informed exactly what role he was playing. Instead of going out and looking for this food, Juan Jr. was the food. Vargas and his gang cornered Juan Jr., beat him to death, butchered his body, and then literally fed him to the inmates. After hearing this horrific story, Carlos was completely destroyed. He went public and had a big press conference to tell the world about what happened to his son, demanding that the authorities take action. But despite there being many eyewitness accounts, ultimately the Venezuelan government denied the cannibalism and nobody was ever held accountable. Doranhel Vargas remains incarcerated and has never been charged with any crimes connected to Juan Jr.'s disappearance. At around 8 p.m. on August 19, 1962, a 12-year-old boy named Raymundo Marfa Dilva sat near the fireplace in the main room of a shack in rural Brazil. Raymundo lived in the shack with his father, Revelino, as well as his two younger brothers who were fast asleep in their beds inside of this main room only a few feet away. Raymundo and his family were very poor. The shack was very small, composed of only 2 rooms, the main room he was in right now, and the kitchen, which was connected by a single wooden door. They were truly out in the middle of nowhere in Brazil. They had no electricity, basically no money, and they really had almost nothing. And so that night, as Raymundo sat by the fire, just kind of quiet, his father, Revelino, came into the room from the kitchen. He sat down next to him, and the two just sat there quietly, enjoying the silence, doing their best not to wake up the 2 younger brothers who were breathing softly in their sleep. As they were sitting there, suddenly Raymundo heard a strange sound coming from the kitchen. He turned his attention and looked into the dark kitchen, and he saw a dark figure on all 4s quickly maneuvering across the ground out of sight. Raymundo was terrified. He turned to his dad, who was also staring at the kitchen door, wide-eyed, clearly having seen the same thing. Before Raymundo could do anything, his dad jumped up, slammed the door shut, separating them from the kitchen, and locked it. At that point, the 2 younger brothers woke up, and all 4 of them were looking at each other, wondering what was going on. Raymundo asked his dad what that was. Revelino was very unsettled. They did not have pets, and there were no other people inside of their shack. Revelino told his boys, "It is okay, I do not know what that is, but let us just stay here. We are safe. The door is locked, and we are all together." For a little while, they heard nothing. There were no more sounds coming from the kitchen. But eventually, Revelino and his sons began to hear voices. And they were coming from outside the shack. At first, they could not really tell what these voices were saying, but eventually they all began to hear the same thing. Whoever was out there was talking about Revelino. They could hear his name, and what they were saying is that if Revelino came out there, they were going to kill him. The boys were terrified and asked their dad what they should do. Revelino told his boys, "It is okay, I do not know what is going on, but clearly somebody is playing a cruel joke on us. This has to be a prank." He told his sons that they were just going to stay put in this room where they were safe, wait until the sun comes up, and then figure out who was playing this prank on them. Sure enough, Revelino and his sons stayed in their room, barely sleeping, all the way until 6 a.m., when the sun began to come up. At that point, Revelino told his sons to stay put, and he was going to go out there and investigate. By this point, they had stopped hearing voices, and it felt like whoever was out there had passed. Revelino walked over to the door that led into the kitchen, unlocked it, opened it up, and looked inside. He told the boys to stay there, and then he went out into the kitchen and shut the door behind him. While he was out there, the boys listened anxiously, but they just heard the sound of their dad walking around the kitchen. There was no commotion. A couple of minutes later, Revelino came back into the main room. He had a knife in his hand, but he told them, "It is okay. There is nothing out here. I am now going to go outside and make sure nobody is outside the hut. Stay put. I will be right back." Revelino walked out again into the kitchen, shut the door behind him, and the boys heard the sound of the back door opening. Presumably, Revelino went outside, and that was the last time the boys ever spoke to their father. 6 months later, on March 10th, 1963, 5 men were out hunting in the wilderness not far from the shack. At some point, they came across a huge boulder. This boulder had a big crevice in it, and one of the hunters happened to walk past and look inside. There, they found a skeleton. That skeleton belonged to Revelino, Raymundo's father. But that was not the end of the story. On the day that Revelino stepped out the front door and was never heard from again, Raymundo felt really nervous. He defied his father, opened up the door that led to the kitchen, and looked towards the outside door. It was wide open. He saw his dad stepping into a huge cloud of yellow smoke. Amidst this smoke were these cylindrical objects floating in the air, spinning around in a circle, and seemingly spitting out the smoke. Raymundo had no idea what he was looking at, but he saw his dad walking into this cloud. The smoke got so bad, it totally obscured his dad, who disappeared. Raymundo yelled out for his dad and charged towards him to try to stop him, but as soon as Raymundo went out into the yellow smoke, the smoke just dissipated. The cylinders disappeared, and his dad was gone too. Raymundo sprinted around, calling for his dad, but there was no sign of him. They alerted authorities, who launched a search, but they could not find him. And then, 6 months later, his body was found in that crevice. To this day, nobody knows what actually happened to Revelino, how he wound up inside of that rock crevice, what that dark figure in the kitchen was, or what those floating cylinders were. It remains a mystery. On the afternoon of June 1st, 2018, 36-year-old Luis Garcia headed into Mexico City to meet up with his older brother. The two of them were very close and had been through a lot together. When Luis was 14 years old and his older brother was 15, their parents went through a really messy divorce. During it, their father walked out on them, and they never saw him again. Shortly after that, their mother remarried, and her new husband moved in with the family. And shortly after that, their mother just vanished. The boys asked their stepfather where she was, but he would say, "I do not know. She went out on an errand and she never came back." The boys were very suspicious because this did not feel like something their mom would do. But just a couple of days after their mom disappeared, their stepfather disappeared too. Suddenly, these teenage boys were left to fend for themselves. They contacted the police, explaining that they thought something happened to their mom and that their stepfather had something to do with it. The police launched an investigation, but they could not find their mother or their stepfather. After the police wound down their investigation, the two boys who had been orphaned learned to fend for themselves, but they never stopped looking for their mom. For nearly 2 decades, they continued to search Mexico City, but they could never get any closure. Today, the two brothers had met up not to go looking for their mom, but instead to meet at their childhood home. After they were abandoned, they had lived in the house on their own, grown up there, and eventually moved out to start their own adult lives, but they had never sold the house. Now, they were going back to clean it up and do some basic renovations. The two brothers met up at the home and went inside. Old photos were still on the wall, and memories came rushing back, many of which were very sad and troubling. They decided that since the place had been sitting there for years and had fallen into disrepair, they would fix it up. Over the next couple of days, they called in some contractors to begin doing some basic renovations while the brothers continued to clean up and pack things. On one particular day, a group of contractors was working in the master bedroom. The brothers were in the living room doing their own thing when they heard a big commotion coming from the master suite. One of the contractors began yelling for the brothers to get in here and look at what he had found. The two brothers got up, bolted into the master suite, and looked at something sitting on the ground. At first, they did not even know what they were looking at. But then, the contractor, after composing himself, told them what it was, and suddenly the boys understood what had happened to their mother. It turned out the brothers were right. Their mother had not simply gone out and abandoned her sons. Instead, on the day she left and never came back, she had been bound, gagged, and stuffed inside the wall of their family home. We know this because when the contractor was doing renovations inside that home, his sledgehammer went into the wall in the master suite. When he pulled it out, a white object came tumbling out. That object was their mother's skull. After pulling apart the wall and looking inside, they found the rest of her skeleton, clearly bound and gagged. Most disturbingly of all, they also found scratch marks inside the wall, suggesting she was alive when she was put in there, desperately trying to get the attention of her sons, but nobody could hear her. Following this horrific discovery, the two brothers went to the police in Mexico City and told them what happened. The police came to the house and looked all over, trying to figure out who killed her, but they could not solve it. The police always suspected the stepfather, given that he went missing a couple of days after the mother did, but they could never locate him. Today, he would be well over 90 years old and is very likely already dead. The brothers were left with a devastating sense of grief, knowing that their mother had been right there the whole time, trapped inside the walls of the home where they lived, while they spent years searching the streets of the city for her. It was a tragic end to a decades-long mystery. They had to deal with the realization that their lives had been completely altered by a monster who lived under the same roof. The trauma was immense, but it also brought them closer together as brothers, having survived such an unimaginable ordeal. They decided to finally tear down the house, unable to live with the physical structure that had held such a dark secret for so long, and instead built a beautiful memorial to honor their mother's life and ensure she was never forgotten. It was a way for them to reclaim their lives and find a sliver of peace. Now, as of right now, we have a brand new show, a history podcast. But wait, it is not like a boring history show. This is not like, when you were in school and you had to sit through lectures about something that happened hundreds, thousands of years ago. It is not that. We are going to pull from history, but we are going to tell the true stories behind moments in history. We are going to give you stories that feel like classic, suspenseful stories with plot twists and crazy points of view. It is going to be classic storytelling, but again, historical is the context. Here, let me give you an example. So, if you look back and try to identify the first time true crime sort of became a thing that the public was suddenly interested in, a case that really had nothing to do with them just because it was entertaining, that case would be about this murderer who escaped. And that is kind of all that is available if you look it up. Oh, yep, escaped murderer. That is when true crime became a thing. But did you know that that case, the escaped murderer, was way more compelling and exciting than most people give it credit for? People were interested at the time because there was this crazy transatlantic boat chase, and there was this crazy hunt for the killer, and the killing itself was so grisly. And that story really does not get told much. It is just kind of a statistic in a history book. And so what this podcast does is it finds cases like that and actually shows you why history is so cool and so interesting. And that is just episode 1. So this new history podcast is called A Twist of History, and it is live right now. So go to any platform where you get your podcasts and look up A Twist of History, or just search for MRBALLEN Studios and you can find it that way. Follow the show and tune in each week. And if you really want to, give us a 5-star review. The show is totally free. New episodes every Wednesday. Oh, and one more thing. Be sure to stick around till the end of today's video for a sneak peek of episode 1. It was July 9th, 1910. A 16-year-old boy flies down 4 flights of stairs of a concrete office building and steps out onto Borough High Street on the south bank of the River Thames. The noise hits him immediately. People are rushing down the sidewalk, the road filled with a mix of horse-drawn buggies and rattling automobiles. The street is so crowded it overwhelms the boy. He quickly pulls his hat down further to partially cover his face and starts weaving his way through the foot traffic. He darts his eyes back and forth, convinced that someone is going to recognize him. He can feel his heartbeat all the way up in his ears. He keeps rushing and scanning the street, but nobody pays any attention to him. So, the boy finally relaxes a little. He slows down to a normal walk and makes his way to the entrance of a nearby London Underground station. A few minutes later, the boy sees his father coming towards him, holding a single small suitcase. The boy greets his father, and they run down the steps together into the underground just in time to catch the next train. The boy watches the train doors close and the mass of passengers exiting. He looks around to make sure he still has not been recognized and follows his father on board. As the train car continues to fill up, the boy and his dad lower their heads, avoiding eye contact with their fellow passengers. And finally, the train starts to roll down the underground tracks, and the boy and his father exhale. Their escape from England has begun. It was a quiet, tense moment, but they knew they had to keep moving. But let us talk about what made this case so famous. Back in 1910, there was no internet, no smartphones, and no television. The only way people got their news was through the newspapers that were printed several times a day. And when this particular murder was discovered, it completely captivated the public. The details of the crime were so shocking that they quickly became the talk of the entire city. People were buying every edition of the newspaper just to read the latest updates. The police were under immense pressure to find the killer, but the suspect had a massive head start. He had managed to slip away from London unnoticed, leaving the detectives completely baffled. They had no idea where he had gone, but they knew he had to be fleeing the country. This led to a frantic search of all the major ports in England, with officers checking every ship that was departing for foreign lands. But the suspect was clever. He had disguised himself and was traveling under an assumed name, making it incredibly difficult for the authorities to track his movements. The chase quickly expanded beyond the borders of England, turning into an international manhunt that captured the attention of people all over the world. As the days went by, the tension continued to mount. The police received countless tips from the public, but most of them led to dead ends. They were racing against the clock, knowing that with every passing hour, the suspect was getting further and further away. But then, a breakthrough occurred. A sharp-eyed witness reported seeing a man matching the suspect's description boarding a steamship bound for North America. This ship was already in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, completely cut off from the rest of the world, with no way for the police to reach it. Or so the killer thought. What the suspect did not realize was that this particular ship was equipped with a brand new technology that was about to change the world of crime detection forever. It was a wireless telegraph. The captain of the ship was able to send a message back to England, confirming that the suspect was indeed on board and was traveling with a companion who was disguised as his son. This news sent shockwaves through the police department, and they immediately put a plan into action. A team of Scotland Yard detectives boarded a faster, more modern steamship determined to overtake the suspect's ship before it reached its destination in Canada. It was a high-stakes, dramatic race across the ocean, with the entire world watching and waiting to see who would win. Every day, the newspapers published updates on the positions of the two ships, and the public followed the chase with bated breath. It was the first time in history that a manhunt was followed in real time by millions of people across the globe, creating a level of excitement and suspense that had never been seen before. It was a watershed moment that marked the birth of the public's obsession with true crime stories, setting the stage for the genre that continues to fascinate us today. And on our new podcast, A Twist of History, we are going to dive deep into all the incredible details of this legendary chase, exploring the brilliant detective work, the technological breakthroughs, and the final, dramatic confrontation that took place on the shores of Canada. We will show you the human side of this historic event, bringing the characters to life and making you feel like you are right there in the middle of the action. This is just one of the many mind-blowing stories we have in store for you, and we cannot wait for you to hear them all. So, if you are ready to experience history in a whole new way, go and check out A Twist of History right now. It is available on all your favorite podcast platforms, and new episodes will be released every Wednesday. Do not miss out on this incredible journey through the past. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the morning of Saturday, the 18th of November, 1961, a 23-year-old man named Michael Rockefeller grabbed the starter cord on his boat's small outboard motor and yanked it hard. The engine sputtered once and died. He tried again. Nothing. With every failed attempt, Michael and his small crew drifted farther away from the coast of New Guinea and deeper into the waters of the Arafura Sea. And the dead engine wasn't even their biggest problem. Their boat, a 40-foot catamaran built from two massive handcrafted canoes tied together, was rapidly taking on water. It was sinking. Just minutes earlier, everything had been going according to plan. Michael and his companions had been traveling along the dense, jungle-covered coastline of New Guinea on their way to visit the Asmat tribe. But to reach them, they had to cross a dangerous stretch of water where a muddy river emptied into the sea. The collision of the river current and the ocean created violent, unpredictable waves. As their boat entered the rough water, wave after wave crashed over the sides, flooding the deck and killing the engine. Now, stranded miles from shore in a sinking boat, Michael Rockefeller was about to disappear into one of the most disturbing mysteries of the 20th century. What had brought him to this remote corner of the world was an obsession with the artwork created by the Asmat people, especially their sacred sculptures known as bispoles. He was completely obsessed with the artwork created by the Asmat people, especially their unique and sacred sculptures known as bispoles. These weren't just simple carvings. They were incredibly intricate works created by master carvers within the tribe. They would take a single massive piece of wood and painstakingly etch it away until it looked like a column of human figures, one standing on the shoulders of the next. The poles were beautiful and powerful to look at, but to the Asmat, they weren't made for display. They believed these poles contained the souls of warriors from their tribe who had been killed in combat. And until the tribe avenged the deaths of those warriors, essentially by killing their enemies in return, those souls would remain trapped within the wood. This meant the Asmat never sold them or got rid of them. These poles were a fundamental part of their culture and their spiritual world. Months before this trip, Michael had visited the Asmat tribe. He had learned all about the bispoles and what they represented. He believed he had successfully negotiated a deal to acquire one. He would trade his modern goods, things the tribe couldn't get, for one of their sacred poles. Michael had given them everything he promised, but the tribe had never sent the pole. So now he was on his way back. He was determined to claim the artifact he felt he had rightfully bartered for. But as he sat in his sinking boat, watching the shoreline of New Guinea become a distant green line, the bispole was the last thing on his mind. He just needed to figure out how to survive. There were 3 other people on the boat with him. There was a French anthropologist named René and 2 teenage guides who were actually from the Asmat region themselves. Their names were Simon and Leo. After Michael failed to get the engine running, René tried, then Simon, then Leo. They all yanked on the pull cord until their arms were sore, but the motor was dead. Finally, Simon and Leo, who knew these waters better than anyone, spoke up. They told Michael and René that their only option was to abandon the catamaran. They needed to jump into the water and swim for shore. At that moment, the coast was about half a mile away, which was a long swim but doable. The problem was they were drifting so fast that if they waited much longer, the distance would become impossible. René, however, was not a strong swimmer. And Michael, for his part, wasn't ready to give up on the expedition just yet. The catamaran was loaded with all the goods he had brought for bartering. He had bundles of tobacco, spools of fishing line, clothes, candy, and steel tools. He knew the tribe didn't have these things, and he saw them as his leverage, not just for the bis pole, but for other unique pieces of art they might have. Even though he knew the boat and everything on it was going to sink eventually, he just couldn't bring himself to abandon it all right then and there. So, a new plan was formed. The two teenage guides, Simon and Leo, would make the swim alone. They would go for help, while Michael and Renee stayed with the sinking vessel. A few moments later, the two young men slipped over the side and began their long, arduous swim towards the shore. As Michael watched them go, it must have dawned on him just how far he was from his own world. It had been months since he had a proper shower. He was caked in dirt and salt, his skin was sunburned, and his hands were rough and calloused from paddling. This was not the life he was born into. Because Michael wasn't from New Guinea. He was from America, and his family was one of the wealthiest, most powerful families in the history of the world. He was a Rockefeller. His grandfather was John D. Rockefeller, the oil tycoon who was, at the time, literally the richest man on the planet. And his father, Nelson Rockefeller, was the governor of New York and would later become the vice president of the United States. But Michael wasn't interested in a life of politics or business. He had found his true calling in the remote jungles of New Guinea. He had first come to the island 7 months earlier as part of a film crew from Harvard University. They were there to document a remote tribe, and Michael simply fell in love with the raw adventure of it all. During that trip, while filming a battle between two tribes, he had even been accidentally shot in the shoulder with an arrow. But instead of being scared off, the experience only deepened his connection to the place. In fact, he never even told his powerful family about being wounded. He was worried that if they found out, the Rockefellers might seek some kind of retribution against the tribe that had inadvertently hurt him. Michael was incredibly respectful and protective of the people he met in New Guinea. In many ways, he felt more at home with them than he did with his own family. So after the Harvard film crew finished their documentary and went back to America, Michael stayed behind. Around that same time, his father, Nelson, had opened a new museum in New York City called the Museum of Primitive Art. It displayed artwork from places exactly like New Guinea. Now, this was the early 1960s, and many Westerners viewed the indigenous people of New Guinea as primitive or savage. So, a lot of people went to the museum out of a kind of morbid curiosity to see what these backwards people were creating. But Michael had a much deeper understanding. He felt it was his personal mission to find the most incredible art New Guinea had to offer, like the Asmat bis poles, and send it back to his father's museum. He didn't want it to be a spectacle. He wanted people in the West to see the beauty and complexity of this art and to respect the people who made it, just like he did. So he had teamed up with Renee, the French anthropologist, to travel all around the island searching for these masterpieces. A few hours after Simon and Leo had jumped into the sea, Michael and Renee had no way of knowing if the boys had even made it. No rescue boats had appeared on the horizon. For all they knew, they were completely on their own. And their catamaran was sinking lower and lower. At one point, they started grabbing buckets and desperately bailing water out, but it was a useless effort. The water was coming in way too fast. Then a large rogue wave slammed into them, and the entire catamaran flipped over, throwing Michael and Renee into the rough sea. Luckily, they were both able to surface and swim over to the overturned boat. There was an air pocket trapped underneath the hulls, which was keeping it afloat. So they just held on, with Michael also using an empty gas canister he had tied to his belt as an extra flotation device. They just floated there, holding on to the wreckage, hoping that Simon and Leo had made it and that help was on the way. But in the back of his mind, Michael knew that if help didn't come soon, he would have to do something drastic. He would have to attempt that swim to shore himself, a shore that was now much, much farther than half a mile away. By the next morning, as the sun rose over the Arafura Sea, Michael and Renee were still in the water, still clinging to the boat. No help had come. Michael was an excellent swimmer, but by now he estimated they were at least 5, maybe even 10 miles from the coast. It would be a monumental swim in very dangerous, choppy water. But Michael was a Rockefeller. He was confident, and he had an unshakable belief in his own abilities. He started telling Renee that he was going to do it. He told him, "I can make it. I know I can swim the whole distance, even if it's 10 miles. You just hang tight. It'll take a while, but I'll get us help." Renee pleaded with him not to go. It seemed like suicide. But Michael was determined. He said he had to do something, otherwise they were both going to die out there. And so, all Renee could do was watch as Michael stripped off some of his clothes to reduce drag, attached a second gas canister to his belt for more buoyancy, and then, after shaking Renee's hand, he turned towards the distant shore. At around 8 a.m. on Sunday, the 19th of November, 1961, Michael Rockefeller started to swim. About 12 hours later, that night, Renee was still alone, holding on to the catamaran, exhausted and losing hope. Suddenly, the sky above him erupted in a brilliant flash of light. A plane was flying overhead. They had spotted him and had fired a flare to let him know that help was on its way. Just a couple of hours after that, a boat appeared and pulled Renee from the water. As he climbed aboard, weak but overwhelmingly relieved, he asked the captain if Michael had sent them. He asked if Michael Rockefeller had made it to shore and told them where he was. The captain looked at him and said no. He told Renee they had been alerted by 2 teenage guides, Simon and Leo, who had made it to shore hours earlier. No one had seen or heard from Michael at all. As soon as that news was relayed, it was like an explosion went off within the Rockefeller family. They mobilized everything. All of their money, all of their resources, all of their political influence was brought to bear on one single goal: finding Michael. They launched what was probably the largest and most expensive manhunt in history up to that point. They dispatched private ships, helicopters, and planes. They got the U.S. Navy involved with their own fleet of vessels. They scoured every inch of the coastline and the open sea for weeks. But they found absolutely nothing. No sign of Michael anywhere. The search would unofficially continue for years. It was never as intense as it was in those first few weeks, but there was always someone, some entity funded by the Rockefellers looking for Michael in that area. But by 1964, 3 years after he had started that swim, the family finally had to accept the inevitable. They concluded that Michael must have drowned. He had likely succumbed to exhaustion or the currents during that impossibly long swim to shore. And that became the official story. In America, that's what everyone believed happened to Michael Rockefeller. His sister even wrote a best-selling book about the family's grief and the process of accepting his loss. But in New Guinea, a very different story began to spread. Rumors about Michael's true fate were whispered along jungle trade routes. They were shared between visiting missionaries and gossiped about in the pages of sensational tabloids and adventure magazines. In 1969, 5 years after Michael was officially declared dead, an adventure magazine reporter named Milt Macklin heard a wild story from a mysterious Australian source. This source claimed that he had actually seen Michael Rockefeller alive, living deep in the New Guinea jungle, not far from where his boat had gone down. Despite how unbelievable it sounded, Milt Macklin decided to follow up on the tip. He put together a film crew and flew to New Guinea. He went to the exact area where the source claimed to have seen Michael, and he launched his own investigation. He spoke to locals, he trekked through the jungle, he scoured the region, but he found no sign of Michael. Milt, feeling defeated, eventually returned home. He ended up writing his own best-selling book about his failed quest to find the lost Rockefeller heir. But here's the crucial detail. Even though he had shot hours and hours of film footage of the tribes in that area, both from a distance and up close, he and his team never really went back and reviewed it. They shot it, didn't find Michael, and just put all the film cans into storage. 40 years later, another documentary film crew decided they were going to make a film about the enduring mystery of Michael Rockefeller. The rumors that he was still alive and living in the jungle had never completely died out. Before this new crew went to New Guinea themselves, they did their research and they managed to uncover all of that old, unwatched footage from Milt Macklin's 1969 expedition. They sat down and began to watch all of it hour after hour. And that's when they found something that no one could believe. Buried in all that footage was a single brief shot. It was filmed from a distance with the camera on land looking out towards the water. A long war canoe filled with Asmat warriors paddles into the frame. It's clearly a war party on their way to a battle or a raid. But as the camera holds on the canoe, you can see that among the dark-skinned, powerfully built Asmat men, there is one person who stands out completely. He is a naked, bearded white man. And even though the film quality was poor and the shot was from far away, he looked, for all the world, like an older Michael Rockefeller. As soon as this footage was made public, the story went viral. The old rumors exploded into a full-blown global theory. The heir to one of the world's greatest fortunes hadn't died at all. He had survived his swim, been accepted by the Asmat, and had chosen to turn his back on his family and his old life to live as one of them in the jungle. Now, of course, there was no way to prove it was really him. It could have been a missionary, or a trader, or some other white person who happened to be in that remote part of the world. But the story was just too incredible, and it spread everywhere. In 2012, more than 50 years after Michael Rockefeller disappeared, a National Geographic journalist named Carl Hoffman decided he was going to be the one to finally get to the bottom of the mystery. He had been fascinated by the story since he was a kid. He and an interpreter traveled to New Guinea, to the very region where Michael had been last seen. They didn't just visit. They lived with the Asmat people for months. They learned their customs, they earned their trust, and eventually they earned their respect. And after months of this, the village elders began to tell Carl a new story. It was a story he had never heard before, the real story of what had happened to Michael. But they gave him a very serious warning. They told him that if he ever repeated what they were about to tell him, the entire village would likely be killed in retaliation, and maybe he would be killed too. But Carl didn't listen. After he heard the truth, he left New Guinea and wrote a book about it called Savage Harvest. And according to that book, this is what really happened to Michael Rockefeller. On the morning of the 19th of November, 1961, about 24 hours after Michael had jumped into the sea and started his long swim, a group of about 50 Asmat warriors were resting. They were in 8 long canoes, gathered at the mouth of the same river that had caused Michael's boat to capsize. 3 of the tribe's elders, men named Finn, Ajim, and Pep, were among them. They weren't really going anywhere. They were just relaxing after a long journey, some smoking loosely wrapped cigars, others chewing on a starchy flower made from a palm plant. They were all naked, except for a few decorative bands on their arms and legs. Some had intricate bone piercings through their noses and ears. It was a peaceful scene. Then, suddenly, Ajim, one of the elders, spotted something out in the water. It was a white object moving slowly from the open sea into the mouth of their river. It was slithering through the water. Ajim immediately called out to the others. He shouted that there was something coming, maybe a white crocodile or a sea serpent. They all turned to look. Slowly, this strange white thing was getting closer and closer. Not wanting to be caught by surprise, the entire group of warriors readied their weapons and began paddling their 8 canoes out to intercept whatever it was. If it was a threat, they would deal with it. As the canoes converged on the object, some of the men had their spears raised, ready to strike. But when they finally got close enough to see it clearly, they realized it wasn't a monster. It was a man. A white man. He was floating on his back, exhausted, with 2 strange containers tied to his belt. He was clearly not a threat. At once, the warriors lowered their spears. Some of them even laughed, relieved that there was no danger. The white man, Michael Rockefeller, rolled over in the water and looked up. He couldn't believe his eyes. After swimming for nearly a day, he had been found by the very people he had been trying to reach. He thought they were there to rescue him. Almost crying with relief, he swam the last few feet and grabbed onto the side of one of the canoes. As he held on, one of the elders, a man named Pep, looked down at Michael. Then Pep looked up at the other 2 elders, Finn and Jean. They just stared at each other for a long moment. They looked back down at Michael, then back at each other, and then all 3 of them gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was an agreement. Pep then reached down and helped a completely exhausted Michael into the canoe. Michael immediately collapsed in the bottom of the boat, just overcome with relief and fatigue. He just lay there as the Asmat warriors turned their canoes around and began paddling back up the river inland. As they paddled, all 50 of them in all 8 canoes began a strange rhythmic chant. It was a powerful, unified sound that echoed across the water. Michael, who had studied Asmat culture, had never heard this particular chant before. He was mesmerized by it. He tried to ask the men in his canoe what it meant, but they completely ignored him. They just kept paddling and chanting, so Michael just lay back, listening, letting them carry him to what he believed was safety. Then, all at once, the chanting stopped. The canoes turned and pulled into a small, muddy inlet that led to a clearing on the riverbank. Michael noticed they were slowing down, so he propped himself up and looked over the side of the canoe, expecting to see their village. But there was no village. It was just an empty clearing. Right away, Michael started to feel a sense of urgency. He thought, I need to get to their village so I can find someone to contact the authorities. They need to go rescue Renee. They need to find Simon and Leo. He started trying to ask the men in his canoe for help, but the language barrier was immense. Neither side could understand the other. Then one of the Asmat men just started laughing at Michael. When he did, the rest of the warriors looked over, saw what was happening, and they all began to laugh too. A chorus of laughter directed at him. Michael had no idea what was going on. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the laughing stopped. In an instant, they were all back to that strange, rhythmic chanting. The warriors began to climb out of their canoes and wade onto the shore. Michael started to sense that something was very, very wrong. Instead of getting out of the canoe with them, he instinctively lay back down, almost as if he was trying to hide. As he did this, the same tribesmen who had first laughed at him stood over him, still chanting. He smiled down at Michael. And then he raised his spear and drove it directly into Michael's side. The second the spear went in, other members of the tribe raised large ceremonial horns and began to blow them, a loud, bleeding sound. Michael screamed in pain, but he was too weak to fight back. He rolled over to his other side, trying to protect himself, and the man just smiled, lifted his bloody spear, and drove it into Michael's other side. After pulling the spear out, Michael, now in horrible pain but running on pure adrenaline, managed to pull himself up and over the side of the canoe. He fell out into the mud and tried to stand up, tried to get away, but he had nowhere to go. As he fumbled in the mud, two of the tribesmen walked up behind him, grabbed him under his arms, and began to drag him. They carried him across the clearing and into the jungle. And as they walked, the rhythmic chanting and the periodic blasting of the horns continued. They dragged Michael through the jungle until they reached another, more hidden clearing nowhere near their village. They took him to the center of it and forced him onto his knees. Michael was hunched over, clutching his bleeding sides, surrounded by a circle of chanting warriors. Then, one of the tribesmen walked up to Michael, grabbed his head by the hair, and pushed it forward, exposing the back of his neck. Another warrior stepped into the circle. The chanting grew louder. The horns blew again. This second man raised a stone axe high over his head and brought it down with full force onto the back of Michael Rockefeller's neck. It turns out the Asmat tribe knew exactly who Michael was. They remembered him from his visit months earlier when he had tried to trade for their bispoles, and they had been deeply offended. They couldn't believe that this rich, white outsider had shown up and thought he could just buy one of their most sacred objects, an object containing the souls of their ancestors, as if it were just some trinket to be put on a sleeve in a faraway museum. They held on to a deep resentment for him. That was why they never sent the pole. They were never going to give it to him. So, when Michael had, by some strange twist of fate, floated right into their river, the three village elders, Finn, Ajim, and Pep, saw it as a sign. That look they exchanged, that nod, was an agreement. They were going to ritualistically kill Michael. His death would be the vengeance they needed to release the souls of their fallen warriors trapped in the bispoles, especially the souls of those who had been killed by white men in the past. Michael was going to pay for the crimes of others. That chant Michael had heard was the chant they performed during their execution ritual. And they didn't just kill him. After the axe came down on his neck, another tribesman stepped forward with a knife. He grabbed Michael's hair, pulled his head back, and severed it from his body. Then, as the chanting and horns continued, other members of the tribe moved in and began to systematically dismember Michael's body. They cut him to pieces, separating his organs, his flesh, and his bones into different piles. They quickly got a fire going. And then they cooked and ate him. Of all the parts of his body, his brain was considered the most powerful prize. Only the three elders, Finn, Ajim, and Pep, were allowed to eat it. After they had finished the feast, they wrapped up the remaining meat in leaves to take back to the village and eat later. Finn, one of the elders, took Michael's skull. He would bring it back, cover it in banana leaves, paint it, and keep it as a trophy. A few days later, when that massive Rockefeller-funded search party descended on the area, the Asmat tribe knew they could never say a single word about what really happened. If the story got out, they were certain that Westerners would come and exact a terrible revenge on their entire village. And so, for decades, their secret was safe. It was only passed down through oral tradition until the journalist Carl Hoffman finally heard it and published it in his book. But, despite the book and its detailed, horrific account, there were always questions about its credibility. The story of Michael Rockefeller was already so full of mystery and strange theories. And so, to this day, the Rockefeller family and official authorities have never acknowledged this version of events. The official story remains unchanged. Michael Rockefeller drowned while swimming to shore to get help. That's it. Thank you so much for watching. To this day, no one knows for certain what happened to Michael Rockefeller out there on the coast of New Guinea. Maybe he drowned during that impossible swim to shore. Or maybe the story whispered among the Asmat people for decades was true all along. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to check out our other true crime and mystery stories. And if you have your own theory about what really happened to Michael Rockefeller, let me know down in the comments. Until next time.